penultimate session today is the last panel conversation of the day, which will explore dual-use technology, autonomous technologies, and international security. It's a very important issue, and I'm really pleased to say that with our panel chairing this session, please invite on stage Anja Kaspersen, the Director of Office of Disarmament Affairs at the United Nations. I'm going to take my juice.
Shall I take over? Thank you so much. I'm very excited to see many of you here. This is a very important topic. Thank you to Sarah and the organizers for actually putting this on. We've been discussing a lot about commercial applications, other forms of applications. Now we're going to have a very exciting discussion on the implications and impact on international security. That should be at top of mind for most of us in the room. I'm therefore very excited to introduce Amandeep Gill. He's currently the Executive Director of the United Nations Secretary General High-Level Panel on Digital Cooperation. We also heard him early today, for those of you who were here for that session. He is a former diplomat for India with a very long and distinguished career in disarmament, arms control, national and international security. And he will share with us his view and give an overview of the international security landscape, but also reflect on one of his more recent roles was chairing a UN governmental body looking at emerging technologies in the area of lethal autonomous weapons technologies. And shortly after him, we will come back and engage in a panel discussion on issues related to what he will be speaking about now. So, great honor to welcome Amandeep Gill to the stage.
Thank you, Anja. And like you, I want to use this opportunity to thank Sarah and her team for putting on a great show, an amazing conference, great participation, great balance in terms of the themes chosen, and an incredibly impressive participation of youth, women, and girls. So let's give her and her team a big hand. The topic that's been given to me is international security. Technology and security, technology and warfare have been closely associated for as long as we've had written history. The crossbow, the horse with the stirrup, these have been some of the historic tech revolutions in warfare. And in modern times, you've had the nuclear bomb that upended strategic thinking in the middle of the 20th century. In fact, the UN Charter, which was written just before the nuclear weapons were used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, didn't have that use case in mind. So the UN system had to scramble to deal with that tech revolution. And the story continues with long-range missiles, with cruise missiles in particular, and in the early part of the 21st century with cyber weapons. Cyber weapons introduced a new dimension to international security. We were familiar with hacking, with criminal activity using cyber tools, but when states or non-state actors associated with states begin to use these tools for national security, for defense or offense, the equation changes. And coming with the rise of the non-state actor, this became an important concern. You would remember that in the earlier part of this period, the concern was more about what cyber warfare can do to critical infrastructure, our power plants, our banking systems, ATM machines, and so on. But recently, there has been a very critical shift, and that shift is from the harder infrastructure to concerns about softer infrastructure, to the infrastructure of institutions and ideas. So if public opinion can be manipulated, if electoral processes can be interfered with, or if certain communities that have been marginalized in the political discourse get a megaphone through cyber technologies that shifts the assessment of the cyber threat. And this brings us to artificial intelligence. AI brings together the cyber and the physical domain in ways that are unprecedented. So it's not only the prospect of AI being used in what Anya referred to as lethal autonomous weapon systems, but it's also the prospect of AI becoming an enabler for a number of military activities, for legitimate purposes, for national defense, also for perhaps increasing the discrimination in terms of civilian targets and military targets. But there are some risks, there are some concerns about what it means for the existing body of international norms, in particular international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict. Can we hold machines accountable for their actions in warfare? Can we hold the humans who command these machines accountable for what these machines do? Here we faced, when we started this discussion a few years ago, we faced an important obstacle, which is the obstacle of mindsets. Diplomats, military specialists, lawyers are used to looking at weapons as discrete objects. They are used to looking at weapons and the wielder as two separate entities. So when the weapon fuses with the wielder, or when the weapon is not a discrete countable object, it is perhaps lines of code that come together with existing physical systems, then how do you regulate this domain? So this is a problem that we started grappling with a few years ago, and there has been some interesting progress in this domain. Our previous speaker referred to certain principles that Google came up with for responsible use of AI. One of that was about accountability towards people. Now, we had to establish in this domain new ways of underlining accountability in terms of international humanitarian law, ensuring that responsibility for lethal action in warfare can be traced to humans, ensuring that human agency stays within bounds that are familiar to us so far. So there has been progress on this, and I'd be happy to talk about it at a later stage during our discussion. So I want to now go back to Anya so that she can introduce the rest of the panel. Thank you.
So first of all, huge thank you to Amandeep Gill for really setting the scene and taking us from the historical legacies that we are dealing with. You know, the fact that international security and technology is not a new thing, but we have had certain changes, you know, that also forces us to change the way we think about these things, our paradigms, our notions, who we work with, you know, try to de-silo some of these discussions. And for those of you who have not, you know, this is a new field for you, the way of thinking of the impact of AI, the transformative impact of AI onto the international security domain, you can roughly list this in 3 categories. It's analytical capabilities, it's predictive capabilities, and it's operational capabilities. And we will come back to all of these issues, you know, throughout the panel discussion. Just to set expectations in the room, after the first round of interventions from our excellent panelists, I will be coming to you, the audience, to ask a couple of questions. I would ask that you think through what you want to ask, but also keep it succinct and on the message, you know, because we don't have a lot of time and the issue is quite complex. So hopefully we'll get, you know, by the time you leave this room, you would have a better idea of, you know, the transformative impact AI and machine learning will play into the international security domain. So I have an excellent cast of panelists. We have Ilse, who's a unique combination of being an academic and a researcher on these technologies and AI use in the battlefield scenario, and also a major in the Dutch Armed Forces. Amandeep Gill, who we just had the pleasure of listening to. Lydia Kostopoulos, who's a cybersecurity expert, but has a very broad range of experiences, also looking at emerging technology from fashion to art into national security and military applications. And we have Kathleen Lewand, who's with the International Committee of the Red Cross, and looking at the whole regulatory, legal, international humanitarian law / rules of war aspect of this discussion. So Ilse, I'm going to start with you. I mean, you have a very interesting combination, sort of looking at this both from an academic research angle, but also from a military use and use case and application angle. There are benefits and there are downsides and there are risks, and there are too much focus maybe on the tabloid headlines and some of the more dystopian scenarios that is being outlined. But from where you're sitting, where do you see the big trends, and what does your research and your career also put you in terms of describing what we've seen?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, in my work, I'm trying to look at both the benefits and the risks, and to see how we can move forward with that. So one of the things I can see as a benefit is that we can use these type of autonomous systems to increase the security of our troops. If we can leave the dangerous and more dull tasks to machines in combination with human decisions, then we can take the benefits of what those machines can offer us. A good example, I think, is the use of underwater drones for demining. That means that we don't have to put our own personnel in harm's way to find the mines and to search for them, and then we can actually use the drones to do that. Another thing I think we can use artificial intelligence and autonomous systems for is looking through really large sets of data. So we don't have humans looking at big screens for hours in a day, but we can use machines to detect anomalies, present them to a human operator, and then have the human decide if we have to act on it or not. The risks being that you have to really take care of that we don't rely too much on machines. We also have to consider that the machine can be wrong. We also and that we have to make some common decisions, of common ground decisions, common sense decisions when we're looking at anomalies.
And if I may follow up on what you talked about, in some ways the automation of decision making or using data and using machine learning in decision-making processes. Is that something you see there's an evolution in your military profession?
Yeah, I think that's one of the revolutions we're going to see, especially what Amandeep already mentioned in the cyber domain. Working in that domain, I can see already some trends. We're moving for example, automated vulnerability detection of our networks. That we can respond faster to threats of our own of our infrastructure, of our digital networks. Yeah.
Kathleen, I can go over to you. I mean, the International Committee of the Red Cross has been focusing a lot on these issues, and obviously how it impacts on civilians, how it impacts on the conduct of warfare, so the methods and means of warfare, and also how it relates to existing frameworks and the rules of war. Are we sufficiently prepared? Are there some things we're not seeing? I mean, tell us a little bit of the lay of the land from your perspective, and also being the guardians of the Geneva Conventions, that is very much setting the scene of the conduct of our actions in war.
Okay. Thank you, Anya. First of all, I'm delighted to be here, and delighted to be on this panel of distinguished speakers. I think with any new technologies, there has always been military interest in these technologies, always an interest to how militaries can use these new technologies to their advantages. Amandeep Gill gave us an excellent overview of that earlier. I think it's, however, important to note that today we're at the cusp of a paradigm shift in terms of the new technologies we are faced with and the challenges these new technologies pose to human-centric warfare. Until now, regardless of, I mean, we know that warfare has evolved in a way such that the human soldier has been more and more removed from the battlefield. Remote warfare, the use of remotely controlled weapon platforms such as drones and so on. Now the paradigm shift is when decisions to select and attack targets are actually being carried out, or these processes are being carried out by computer processes, machine learning, artificial intelligence. Ilse gave us examples of where this is going, so that we may arrive at a point where human decision-making, which is central to warfare, which is central to the law of armed conflict, also known as international humanitarian law, what we could call the rules of war, because there are rules in warfare, that these laws, these rules, the human responsibility will be abdicated, as it were, because in fact, human decision-making will be replaced by machine processes and software algorithms. So this is a cause for concern in terms, indeed, of human responsibility to respect the rules of war. What are the rules of war? You've mentioned some of them, Anya, Amandeep as well. The obligation to distinguish civilians from combatants, direct attacks only at combatants and lawful military objectives, the prohibition of indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks, the prohibition to cause excessive suffering in warfare, the obligation of humane treatment. All of these require human judgment under existing rules, and there's a risk of loss of this now with, as we move forward now with delegating increasingly these functions of selecting and attacking targets to machines and machine processes.
So it's changing in some ways the accountability or the decision chain and responsibility of that decision chain.
Absolutely, absolutely. It raises critical questions about human accountability. Our view is that the rules of war require human judgment in decisions, in planning, and selecting and attacking targets. This is fundamental to the rules of war. Removing that human judgment involves a greater risk that these rules will be violated. It also involves a loss of accountability of humans. And this is of profound concern.
Thank you. Lydia, you've been working both in this sort of network-centric systems, so they're more the cyber domain, but also looking more in depth on, what happens when we remove ourselves from the battlefield. You called it as becoming the spectators of war, and you also spoken about the generational divide. So how new generations or the younger generations might look very differently upon the willingness or the risk appetite or the risk willingness, to use some of the systems. Can you comment a bit, on your research and insights into this area?
So thank you very much, Anya. So one of the issues that we need to keep in mind is the character of war and the nature of war. Simply, the character of war is dictated by the technologies that are at play at a current moment in time, and they change. However, the nature of war has not changed, and it has not changed for thousands of years. And why is that? And that's because the nature of war is about human nature. It's about our fear, it's about our courage, it's about our sacrifice, our passion for our nation, and our patriotism. When we remove the human out of that and we look at weapon systems combating other weapon systems, there is no sacrifice, no blood, no passion. It is two systems battling each other. And in that sense, then, we could look at it as we've become spectators to our own war if we're going down that track. Looking at it from a generational perspective, there's a saying that anybody from ages 0 to 15 sees the technology that exists in their life as normal and the way that things are. However, from ages 15 to 35, everything that's new is new to them and it's exciting. However, after 35, everything that's new is just against the way of the world and the way things should be. However, if we take that same philosophy and we apply that to autonomous weapon systems and the development, and look a little bit about what Kathleen had said, this argument about humans and how they should be involved in the loop may be differently perceived by a person who is 5 years old today who understands Alexa to be a normal part of the family. So I think that as we look forward and we look at the changes and the way that we battle, there's two things to look at. One is going to be what technological ability we have and how that progresses and its convergence within that. And then the other main issue is to look at how culture changes and how we relate to technology. So I think those are...
So both of you actually touched a little bit about the automation aspect of it, right? Are we seeing a blurring of lines between what's war and what's peace? And I'll come back to you as well to comment on that. And what does that do with the threshold of war and the character of warfare?
So I think that cyber is a great example for this. So if we step back and look at land, we have territorial sovereignty, and if your military crosses my territorial sovereignty, that is a violation as per international law. However, if we think about the cyber domain and transferring your military, trying to attack another military through the cyber domain, going inside another network, that happens on a daily basis. However, there are no calls for war based on that crossing of territorial cyber sovereignty. So I think that the line is blurring as to where the line really is when it comes to cyber, and there is no agreement yet as to where that red line is because no one has upheld that yet. So.
Do you want to quickly comment on that?
Just a quick comment on that. I think that's an excellent point. I think the cyber is an excellent example, and there are some in the domain of autonomous weapons as well, of how these new technologies are raising unique questions that test the limits of the law, that basically beg the question, well, is new law needed to adapt to these new technologies? And cyber, the example you've given, Lydia, is excellent. What kind of a cyber attack or use of cyber means would be considered sufficient to trigger the application of the law of armed conflict? We don't have a clear-cut answer on this. We're asking states to pronounce themselves on this. How do they interpret the law on this? Same question, turning back to autonomous weapon systems. What is the characteristic of autonomous weapon systems? It's autonomy, as I said earlier, autonomy in the selection and attack of targets. Now, if that autonomous process relies on machine learning and algorithms, and you lose predictability, the black box phenomenon, you don't know how the machine arrived at its decision, there's a loss there, a fundamental loss of predictability, and yet predictability is essential to the use of means and methods of warfare. Commanders need predictability when they are using weapons. They need predictability, that is, foreseeability of the effects of these weapons. They need this to be able to respect the laws of armed conflict. Yet there's a risk of loss of this. How does the law apply in such situations? And this is where we need greater clarity from governments.
Before I come to you, Amandeep, I just want to quickly go back to Ilse, because you are actually on the operational side of this, so you obviously use, analytical tools and the predictive means that this technology offers, but also thinking about the operational applications and also the mitigation of, potential negative outcomes. Do you see that is there sufficient work going into understanding this? Is there collaboration? I mean, there's a lot of talk around defense innovation and trying to link up more with actors on the outside, given how much of the developments, especially in the AI machine learning space, has been driven by the commercial sector. Do we have the right forms of collaborations in place and the right form of building that literacy among military forces in your view?
Well, we are starting within NATO, for example, some forms of collaboration already. We have, for example, the NATO Innovation Hub. That's an open platform for both the businesses and academia and the military to work together on problems related to cyber. They also have an autonomous system program to actually better understand the risks and how to mitigate these when we use those systems in practice. We have too little data and practical experience right now to make very strong claims or statements that this will happen or that will happen. What Kathleen is saying about predictability, that's actually very important to us. We really want to know if we conduct an action or a military operation, what the outcome will be. We really don't like systems that have unintended consequences or things that we cannot foresee. We're always trying to get as much prediction and certainty in our operations as possible. So I agree on that point with you. That's something we have to delve a lot more deeper into than we have right now. Yeah.
Thank you. Amandeep, earlier today you spoke about access and equity and where you stand and from where in the world you view these developments. You know, the reality looks quite different. And the one thing anyone working in international security domain has to reckon with is that technological prowess is really becoming a dominant feature on who would drive the international security landscape going forward. And do you see, given the tools we have at our disposal and building both on your long background in disarmament and arms control, but also now trying to bring some convergence around what are these issues, for the Secretary General on the high-level panel on digital cooperation, do you see that do we sufficiently reflect the issue of access to these technologies? Like you were saying, who has access to predictive analytics and can actually have a defined sense of the outcome and reshape the doctrine on the basis of that, or military doctrine on the basis of that, and those who may not have the access to these technologies, and that would hold them back in this sort of asymmetries that is dominating the military strategic domain. Could you comment a little bit on that, building on both your roles, your previous role and the current one?
Sure. I think that's a very important point, that some of these developments are undermining trust among nations. There are asymmetries, and AI in particular could accentuate those asymmetries, whether it's in the economic domain or in the military domain. It could lower the threshold for the use of force, and it could create a dichotomy between those who have robot soldiers and those who fight with traditional means. And this undermining of trust, which we see, I mentioned cyber manipulation, the AI race in some ways, both the geo-economic and the other race. These make it difficult to build cooperation, and the digital domain requires cooperation. We cannot solve trans-border problems, trans-domain problems without that cooperation. So it's very important to manage this dimension of undermining of trust. Another aspect, to extend what has already been said, is the role of the non-state actor. The non-state actor has been empowered by some of these technologies. So power is diffusing and control becomes more difficult. And therefore, we need to think, as you said, new ways to use the existing toolkit, but also to add some new tools to the kit. And we start with the mindset issue, shift our mindsets to these new technologies, and also look perhaps to the civilian side. I mentioned the Google principles, so some of the dilemmas are similar. If you're looking at autonomous vehicles, so runaway autonomy is not good. Likewise, on the military side, Kathleen mentioned runaway autonomy creates these difficulties. So what are the common design principles? What are the common risk management, testing and validation principles that we can think of? And in any case, in this field, in the military domain, most of the human resources coming from the civilian side. So it's very unlike the past where in the nuclear domain or the space domain, you had largely government-run programs. So it's important for these two sectors to work together. And the UN has a role. You mentioned the discussion that has taken place in Geneva. So through 2 years of a discussion involving different stakeholders, 125 member states, we managed to do two things. One is to increase the level of awareness and literacy in the room about the complexity of the problem and how it is important to do regulation in a new way. The old models don't work, so we have to do a distributed, agile, adaptive type of governance. And the second thing we managed to achieve is a set of guiding principles, 10 commandments, starting from very high-level normative principles like respect for international humanitarian law to some mindset type of issues. Don't anthropomorphize AI, so don't think Iron Man and Terminator when you're looking at these issues. And also some operational principles about risk management, about testing, and some of these issues.
So it's more of a standards way of thinking, not just through the kind of conventional regulatory lens. That's what you're saying.
Yes.
So as for those of you not working on these issues on daily basis, you will probably notice that there are very strong links between all the debates that have happened in the last 2 days here. So international security is facing some of the same dilemmas around automation, be it trust, be it how we use and innovate responsibly, how we make it accountable, how we make it explainable, how we make it usable in terms of validation of between intent and actual desired outcomes. So a lot of the same issues and dilemmas are facing this community and this debate as others. I would like to take a couple questions from the audience and back to the panelists. Do I see any hands? Who has the... Yes? Do you have a microphone? Just a lady here on the first row first.
Hello.
Come to gentlemen.
Hello. My question is about state-sponsored cyber attacks in the form of propaganda meant to divide large or small national populations. Do any of you have thoughts about how a nation can defend itself against these kinds of automated digital intrusions without performing propaganda of the same kind against their own populations?
So offensive purposes of using cyber, yeah. The gentleman in the back here, have a microphone.
Hello, my name is Henk. I'm just wondering if I just go back a couple of hundred of years and instead of cyber, call it gunpowder, I think we could have had the same discussion. So actually nothing new. For us, more to the UN, the rules about that engagement took a long time. We needed a couple of world wars for that. The question is, how can we speed that up? It's about that trust, but we need to speed up actually the way of rules and laws about that, because like the gunpowder, it's going to happen. Somebody's going to use it. We're not going to stop it. So my question is, how can we speed things up on law side?
So how do we make confidence-building measures more forward-looking and effective, if I understand you correctly?
That's correct, because compared to gunpowder, it's going to be used, and AI is going to be used.
We have time for one more question. Guys, this really matter for you, so you better ask your questions now. Here, in the back, a lady.
Hello. My question is about the difference between the civilian and the one in the army. If now humans sometimes cannot make the difference, are we going to use artificial intelligence before we can make that difference?
So using AI to try to distinguish between civilians and combatants?
Yeah, because I suppose they are going to imitate the same thinking as humans. And humans, we make that mistake.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So, varied questions, two of them, one on confidence-building measures. We have one on cyber or network-centric warfare and technologies used for offensive purposes, and one around the combatant civilian blurring of war and peace space. So let me start with you, Kathleen. You already commented on the cyber dimension of it, but maybe on the last question, we'll start with you.
The last question. I think this question comes up quite a lot. And I think what's at the root of your question, Madam, is, since human soldiers, human combatants, very often are not doing very well in warfare in terms of respecting the rules, distinguishing civilians from combatants, etc., then maybe we should give those responsibilities indeed to artificial intelligence. It will do better. I think the response to that is, first of all, that AI and our weapon systems will only be as good as the humans that are programming them. And the challenges that human soldiers face today in distinguishing civilians from combatants, and there are real challenges. Sometimes it is, in the fog of war, it is very difficult to actually positively identify an enemy target. That these difficulties will be just as important for a machine, even more so, in terms of how do you program a machine to carry out the uniquely human judgments that are required by the rule of distinction in attack, but that are required by the rule of proportionality in attack, which requires you to balance the foreseeable civilian harm, deaths, injury, damage to civilian objects, against the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated from the attack. These require uniquely human judgments, and very difficult to delegate these to a machine. So it's, at least in the foreseeable future, it is difficult to see how technology would be able to achieve this. And even beyond that, again, this is a profound question for humanity. It's a profoundly ethical and moral question. To whom do life and death decisions belong? In our submissions, they belong to humans. Humans are responsible and accountable for life and death decisions on the battlefield. AI can help the human soldier, but cannot replace the judgment of the human soldier. So this is what we would advocate for. I would also very briefly make a comment on another question that was made about whether regulation is moving at too slow a pace, in particular on lethal, so-called lethal autonomous weapon systems. I think, and as Amandeep has noted, there is now today consensus. There is a meeting of minds among states around the notion that human judgment, human control must be maintained over weapon systems and the use of force. So there's broad agreement around this. The states use a bit different terms, human judgment, human control, etc. But the human element, there is consensus around this. The problem is, what does that mean in practice? And the hard question today is, how do we turn that consensus around the need to retain human control over weapon systems and the use of force into legally binding criteria?
Thank you for that, Kathleen. Amandeep, I mean, you were mentioning the toolbox and how we may need to rethink that toolbox, not necessarily change it, but think about the mindsets and how it's applied and who's involved in the dialogue. There was one question around confidence-building measures, which we know from the arms control field in particular is sometimes the only tool we have to build that trust and to build those mechanisms of compliance, etc. What's sort of your take on this? How do we become better at that, and how do we leverage what we have?
This is going to be a very important aspect going forward. So if there is this danger of mistrust spreading, we need countries, we need companies to talk more about how they are developing and deploying AI technologies. What is their national vision or corporate vision for developing use cases? What kind of values and principles are they thinking about? And how are they testing for some of the risk scenarios, some of the unintended consequences that might be there? So that is essential, and a start has to be made. And the UN is a good platform for us to be able to exchange national experiences, and also these conferences where different perspectives come together, that they can also help enhance transparency and confidence. I just want to mention one thing in response to the gunpowder question. The problem with the gunpowder example is that we know what is the pathway, the production pathway to gunpowder or nuclear weapons. So we know where to put the controls. And gunpowder is not in every smartphone, every device that's connected to the net. So this is where we need to think differently about the regulation of these technologies. It has to be distributed. There's a important role for industry standards, national and then international, where norms come in.
We're running out of time. I just want to quickly go to you, Lydia, before we round up, because there was 2 questions around offensive purposes of new technologies, and especially in the cyber domain. Do you want to quickly comment on what we heard?
Yes, there was one about influence.
Yes.
And so I think that the first things that come to my mind are critical thinking and a strong narrative. If we can instill better critical thinking among a population and a strong narrative about what the nation's about and its values and what it stands for and where it is on the positions, then I think that that might help. One example that is separate from that I think might be helpful is Santa Claus. We see Santa Claus all the time. We write letters to him, and there are movies about him, but we don't believe that he exists. And so it is possible to have stories that are present every day and we not believe them. So that's just one fun example.
And just quickly to you, Ilse, working on Cyber Command and new technologies and machine learning in particular, is there anything you would like to bring just to close off the debate on this?
Well, coming back to your point, we see a lot of things happening that you mentioned. They're not on the declaration of war, but they are still in our society. And not everything is a military problem. Sometimes it's also that they're attacking our democracy, or they're trying to influence our perception of certain ideas. So we have to look broader, I think, than only a military solution for that. There are other means to actually try to counter that. And there's also a responsibility for the companies, it's for the government, and to see how we can work together to actually make sure that those things don't become threatening to our society. Yes.
National security is indeed a composition of all of these things, right?
Yes.
Excellent note to end on. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. I hope this was a useful and insightful debate. And the only thing I think on behalf of myself and the organizer and the panelists, by putting this particular panel on, is to encourage all of you to build that necessary literacy to understand how these technologies also translate into the security and national defense domain, and also ask questions. Don't think that, oh, I don't get this, I don't work on this daily, so I'm not going to engage on it. You have concerns, ask questions. You see positive applications, raise them. So that was my little empowerment kind of end to this discussion. Thank you so much to the panelists, to Sarah and her team, and to all of you.